part 3 of the coil winder video. You can see the bushing here is soldered into the steel angle. The next step in my coil winder project is to line up all of the base plates and screw them down to the wooden frame. To do this, I need to make the axle rods that are going to go through those bushings, because I'm going to use them to line up all the pieces. If the pieces don't line up and the axle rods can't spin freely, then all of that was a waste of time. To do this, I have some 1/4 inch pieces of 12L14 steel here. I'm going to go ahead and cut the parts I need to their finished dimensions, rather than simply use them as 12-inch pieces to line up the things. That way I can go ahead and have more of the part done. I've got the first of the 4 rods set up in the vise here. I use the green scrubby pad that I have on my bench to wrap the rod around so it gives a nice grip without damaging the rod. When I spin up the rod, I'm going to need to give it some fine polish with some, what they call it, emery cloth, but I have 320 grit sandpaper. That should make the rods nice and shiny and smooth so they can rotate well in the bearings. I was at the home store today and I bought some tapping oil, thread cutting oil, tapping oil, steel cutting, whatever you want to call it. I named it so that I don't mix it up with my other oils. Hopefully it's clear enough. But I'm going to give it a little bit of juice and get started. If you want to search for these bottles on Amazon, they're called sewing machine bottles. They come in a pack of 4 for about $10. They're very nice for getting a little bit of oil where you need and a little bit of oil where you don't, as opposed to a lot of oil. Little medicine dropper type things. I'm not going to explain how to hacksaw something. I would hope that much is painfully clear by now. I've got my blade with the teeth backwards, which allows me to cut on the pull stroke. I'm also whacking my tailstock with this as I'm going. I've used candlesticks before to lubricate my blades when I'm cutting metal. I'm just knocking all sorts of stuff over, aren't I? Alright. And the offcut's long enough where I can do something else with it later. This piece is going to be 10 inches long, and it's going to be the cam follower. It's going to ride up against the rotating disc and move back and forth to guide the coil. Guide the wire shuttle. I know what I'm talking about. And just like that, I have the 4 rods I need. None of these rods require machinist precision to get right. They just need to be roughly in the ballpark. You have to make an honest effort to get them to the dimensions that the book calls out for. Anything that you do other than the dimensions can usually be adjusted out, but you should try to get them close. Now I'm going to chuck each one up in the lathe, face the end down, and I will give each one a polish. I might even do that on the drill press. Who knows? The wrong key. I require the blue key. What you just watched me do is shave the face of this off to be a very flat, unfocused, blurry. There we go. A very flat surface, and also put a beveled edge on it. That will help us when we want to put it through something like a hole where it barely fits. such as the bushings we created earlier, and allow us not to snag our rotating rods on the brass. So what you're seeing me do here, I have a tool for turning steel. It's got clearance angles cut, and it's also got a very blunted nose radius, very round. Theoretically, that will allow for a very smooth surface finish. I've also got a chamfering tool here. It's just a form tool. It's a 90-degree angle. I've got one on this side for steel. It's got a relief angle cut in it. This one here has 0 rate for brass. I'm going to go ahead and face off this other one. You don't want to make many adjustments to the machine while the chuck is turning. Some people don't even put their hands on the machine while the chuck is turning, except for the control dials. Using the chamfer tool on the edges does two things. One, it breaks up the corner, which also takes with it any sort of burrs or other defects at the edge that could get caught on a round hole. And two, if/when I want to thread it later, it gives a good starting surface for the thread die to go on. And that's exactly what I'm going to be doing for some of these, is putting threads on the ends. I'm going to be using 1/4 inch 20 threads for all of the projects, all of the rods in this project. One of these rods calls for a 1/4 inch 20 thread on the end. I mentioned that earlier, but now I'm going to show you how it's done. Lock the tailstock and I can thread, and it holds everything straight. And give it some steel sauce here and get started. And give it a couple of twists. It's very hard to get started. A lot of times you want to pull it off and take a look at your work there. You don't want to do this under power. I've tried it a couple of times and I really haven't had any luck. So you can see I have all 4 of the parts done. This is the main crankshaft. The threaded end will connect to a coupler that connects to a threaded rod. Threaded rod will have two large cones on it, and it will clamp down on the coil form. This here is going to be the crank handle. Put a little crank handle on the end, and you turn that. It turns the friction drive. This here will be the spool rod. Only purpose it serves is to hold the spool of wire. And this here will be what's called the cam follower. There's going to be a hole drilled roughly about 2 inches from one end, and a spring will cause it to ride up against the cam, so it'll go back and forth. So I noticed a problem when trying to get all of these aligned to line up the plates. The holes are so tight in tolerance that the rods can't go through them without binding up the plates. So I could ream them out to a larger hole. I could figure out something else like shimming the plates to make sure that they all align properly. I think right now I'm going to go to bed and sleep on it. The last thing I want to do is get in a hurry and make a mistake. There's not really any way that I could have avoided this except for maybe having the rods in the bushings when I was soldering them, and that would have caused all sorts of other problems. As one might have been able to predict, the rods don't fit as they should. What happened here? So I reamed the inside of the bearings an exact 1/4 of an inch with a reamer, but I soldered them into holes that were drilled on a drill press, and they are aligned by setting these pieces of metal on wood and screwing them in. This one here spins normally, but you can see there's some movement of the frame parts. The top one over here is stuck, and the bottom one doesn't even line up with the holes. How do I fix it? I'm going to get a drill bit that's one size larger than the one I used for the reamer and enlarge the holes just a bit so they move freely. So I took it into the garage and drilled out all the bearings to 17/64, and now all the rods are loose. While taking a hit to my machinist pride for not being able to make them all line up, all the plates line up, which is the important part. Everything spins freely and I can move on with the project. Plus, I'm going farther than most people do, so this thing will work just fine. These two mild steel bars were cut from the 1/8 inch piece of flat bar shown at the beginning of part 1. Their purpose is to hold up the round bar that supports the wire spool and supplies wire during coil winding. They also hold the lever arm that ticks off the counter every revolution. First, I'm going to make a centerline mark on each bar. Since each bar is 3/4 of an inch wide, I'll make a mark at 3/8 on either side of the board. Then I'll use the straight edge to connect the two marks and create a center line. Once I have a center line, I'm going to create two marks for the holes. One mark will be 3/4 of an inch from one end, and the other mark will be 3 5/8 inch from the same end. You always want to make measurements from the same reference end. Right here I'm scribing the center line on the second bar. Line up the ruler to set up 3/4 of an inch from the right side of the bar and make a mark. Then I'll set up the same ruler to make 3 5/8 inch from the same end. If you measure from the same end, you reduce the chances that you make an error and make sure that the spacing of the holes is the same on both bars. That's the important part. The rightmost hole is going to be drilled a little larger than the leftmost, since the main crankshaft is going to spin in that hole. This hole needs to fit loosely over that bar so it doesn't interfere with the rotation. Here I'm marking a third hole, which is located 1/4 inch from the right and bottom side. This will locate a hole for a screw that will screw into the angle bar and prevent the arm from moving much. It'll still have a limited motion, but limited being the key word. Once I've drawn out the locations in the die, we use a spring-loaded center punch to make a dimple in the metal that will guide the drill bit. After we've done that, we use a hammer center punch to deepen the hole to make it easier for the drill to find the proper location. I center it on the dimple made by the spring punch and give it a few good whacks with the hammer to deepen the hole. You have to be careful in doing this too hard or you'll create multiple dimples in the same location, which is not something you want. To begin, we'll take the cam follower rod, insert it through here. How this will work is somewhere around here we'll have a roll pin. A roll pin is just a little springy pin that gets inserted through a hole, and its own friction expands and holds it in the hole. There'll be a spring right here that makes it tend to push this way. Crankshaft will go through here, if I can get that to fit, and it'll be turned against this thing. There will be what's called a cam on here. It's basically an offset disc, kind of like the eccentric in a steam engine, that will push this back and forth in almost a sine wave pattern. The end of the tip of this rod will ride up against the steel disc, and the spring will keep it pressed against that disc. This one here is the one we're locating today, and this one here is the main spindle. It goes here. There we go. So you can kind of see how this thing is taking shape. So the next thing I need to do, I'm going to take this, place it with the screw hole down, place it through here, and slide it all the way up. The bushing prevents me from getting it flush against the steel, but I'll use washers to fix that. I'm going to do the same with the other one. Place it here. It goes through, and these kind of hang down in the back. I'm going to turn it around and get rid of these Q-tips. Q-tips, 1001 uses, but mostly getting in the way. Turn it around, and now if I stick this through these holes, everything can line up. It's important to have everything lined up because I don't want to have these stick out at different angles and not be able to get the rods that go through the holes to line up correctly. But you can kind of see how everything works. And again, there'll be a nut that sits on here and holds it flush against this end. I could put a collar over here if I wanted to, but quote is if I wanted to. This one doesn't really move so much, it just kind of sits there. So next thing I will do is get my marking device, and I'm going to use one of these. These are steam engine projects in the works, if you were wondering. I build wigwag engines every now and then. And we'll do something like this. What I'm going to do is I'm going to mark the holes, and then when I mark them, I'm going to tap them and drill them for an 832 screw. And the 832 screw will hold these arms in position. I'll probably do this one at a time. If I do it one at a time, that will make sure that everything lines up nice. After fiddling with it for a bit using that half-baked engine project, I decided to do something different. This bar of cast iron here, that's going to be a later project for something else I'll show on this channel, gives me about the right height. There's a slight upward angle for this, but not as much. I want to make sure that these are straight most of all, because I'm going to insert washers between the main angle frame and the support arm here, so they're mostly straight. Get our pencil, make a circle on the steel, give us an idea of where to punch the hole. Again, I'm going to do this one at a time, so it should be able to line up correctly. There we go. Alrighty. Now over to the other workbench so I can whack these with a hammer. The support arms for the rod that's going to be the wire spool support had been installed. I bolted them to the frame parts here. That was a bit of a problem because when I drilled the first hole it didn't quite line up, so I had to flip it around and drill it again. So there's a battle scar there from my first attempt that didn't work. But all the rods now have pieces to hold them in place. I had to do a little bit of running in with this one because when I put everything back together I wanted it to be very tight. It didn't move freely, and there's still a little bit of dragging. So the first thing I did was I put a shim in under the screw that's on this side, and the shim was a washer. Just put it around that screw and screwed it down. It lifted this side up a little bit, and lifting that side up made it a little better. But what I ended up doing is I put some metal polish on this steel rod and I ran it in with a power drill for about 5 minutes. And there's still a little bit of a dragging here. If I have to do it if I have to do more, I'll put some toothpaste or other mild abrasive in there and run it in more. You don't want it to be too loose because otherwise the coil won't have good repeatability as far as where the wire lays on the coil. But you also don't want it to be too tight, because if it's too tight then the friction drive won't spin it correctly and you'll get errors in where the wire lays down. That's why the precision is somewhat important on all of this. So, but all these other rods rotate freely and move in and out as necessary. This one here is the one that moves in and out. It won't rotate very much. This one here is the one that's most important to rotate freely. So we want to make sure that it has a good easy and free motion through there. The next step, which will probably be on the next video, I'm going to make a little frame for the counter. It'll sit in here. You literally just bend some sheet metal and drill some holes in it. The sheet metal will hold the counter up right about here-ish, and a long lever arm will come down through here, and when this rotates it'll push the lever arm down and tick off the counter one at a time. So for every one revolution of this shaft right here, I say revolution, I mean rotation. For every one rotation of this shaft, it'll take the counter once and it'll keep track of how many turns of wire are on that coil. The other thing I'm going to make next, once I get done with those, is all these shaft collars. Basically larger pieces of steel that are round, have a hole through them that'll fit on all of the rods, and there'll be a set screw to hold them flat on the rod so that it keeps it in place and there won't be end play, as they call it, where it can move around. I'm going to need probably about a dozen of those for the coil winder to be finished. This concludes part 3 of the coil winder video. Stay tuned for more, and thanks for watching. See you soon.